I don't mean to be heavy, but we're in a situation right now where a lot of our elders are going to die.
It is the kind of elephant in the room, as it were, except it's much smaller than an elephant. It's tiny microparticles that are causing the problem.
President Macron last night just told us that we're at war against the virus. So first of all, I thought, oh, Jesus Christ, it's like, are you trying to be like de Gaulle or something and using this outdated rhetoric? I think that the whole system is so stupid on a spiritual level, right?
Right.
We're at war against the virus. It seems to be the opposite is true. We're going to have to figure out how to
make peace,
cooperate, make peace with each other. Right. Anyway, but
best way of doing this. One of your previous discussions with Zach, I believe he spoke a little bit about the educational meta crisis.
Yeah.
And he spoke a little bit about four main questions he feels are defining of our time. So the kind of meta crisis distilled into four questions. Those are very much his, but they partly came about through conversations we'd had. And the four questions really are: what's going on, roughly, which is a question of sense-making or intelligibility. Mm-hmm. There's a question of, are we up to it, which is basically about capability. Then there's who's in charge and who gets to decide, which is a question of legitimacy, or Zach calls it legitimation sometimes, quoting Habermas. And then finally, there's kind of meaning, or what's it all about? What are we trying to do, right? Now, these four questions can be superimposed on the virus.
Sure. Do you want to go through them?
Yeah.
That's very interesting.
So I would say the intelligibility question, what's going on, is that we're doing that work reasonably well as a species, I think. It could be better, but there is a great deal of sense-making going on. And the challenge is not to rush to judgment about what is a good and bad response. But nonetheless, the problem there is, while you're making sense of things, what do, right? You can't wait for a month to figure out, to get all the data you need to make the fully informed judgment. You have to make a decision often with incomplete knowledge in the context of uncertainty.
Yeah.
And there the question is, that comes into a question of underlying values. I would say the first instinct should be care, kind of caritas rather than veritas. It's like protect what you love and then figure out what the attack is, what the threat is. So personally, I think very early on, when it became clear this was a new kind of infectious disease, a virus that was fatal for a small percentage of the population, that would grow exponentially over time because of the early patterning of increase over weeks.
They missed the exponential curve, kind of
I think.
They weren't able to deal with that.
Either they missed it or they didn't know what it meant. But I think rather than waiting to make perfect sense, what's going on here is how does a human species as a whole deal with conditions of epistemic uncertainty, where we're still looking to authority to tell us what's going on, what do we do? But we can't do that, really. We can, to some extent, defer to experts, to some extent, look for reliable sources, but we still have to figure out for ourselves, do I send my son to school tomorrow or not? Do I go shopping once a week? Is that safe? Or should I wait until, who knows, till it's all cleared up? These questions are ultimately ours to answer, but they arise from the crisis of intelligibility, of not knowing what's going on. And that's heightened at the time of the virus, but it's there all the time.
It's there all the time. Very interesting, yeah.
That's the first thing. The second thing is on capability. There's real questions here about, are we up to it? Now, there's some really good stories here about capability, because 3D machines have been mobilized to create new kinds of medical equipment that wouldn't have been possible a long time ago. There are some signs that vaccination efforts are being accelerated. There's already some evidence about things that we can take to reduce the chance of fatality if we catch it. So it's not as though the human species is not mobilizing a capability response.
Sure.
In many ways, we are up to this. We're also planning carefully to flatten the curve and reduce impacts on hospitals and all that. But it begs the question of, more generally, are we...
Wisdom.
Not yet, Andrew.
Not yet. We're not at wisdom yet. Okay. That was one of my questions for you. Okay, keep going.
Well, I don't know if you know, my PhD was on wisdom, so we'll actually come to that. But in the context of the virus, the capability question is, are we up to dealing with this in a way that minimizes harm? Now, that's not just about the medical response. It's also about the social and civic society response.
Yeah.
For example, enlightened governments would now be doing things like giving a temporary universal basic income to everyone so that there's not... People are not going to work and getting infected, or going to school and getting infected because they have to pay their bills, right?
Yeah.
That you need to take that problem out of the equation. So there's a capability question that's heightened. Are we up to it?
Are we going to leave a lot of people behind, even if we solve the problem? People who can't afford to pay the bills after losing their job.
Well, that comes to the next bit, legitimacy, because there are justice questions and fairness questions. The question of legitimacy looms large here because it's about who gets to decide who lives and dies, on what basis, right? So the UK government, for example, appeared to make a decision that would put the elders especially, and I call them the elders rather than the elderly because...
the elders, yeah. I think we need to talk about the elders. I'm just going to bracket that because they're not the elderly. There are the elders. They're the history of our civilization.
Right.
They contain the knowledge. I mean,
totally.
You're looking at older people as elders, really.
Indeed. And yet they're sometimes described in a sort of sense that would make it look like they were dispensable.
Indeed, yeah.
And the same with underlying conditions. We use that term as if, we're already somehow halfway gone. But actually, I'm type 1 diabetic. I have an underlying condition. I know many of my family does too. And so this virus is a real and present danger to lots of people. And governments are making decisions that will have very direct bearings on who lives and dies. That's a legitimacy question. And it's heightened, right? And then finally, the meaning crisis, which I'm sure will be the one that interests you the most. Here's something that I learned from a conversation with Bonita Roy. I forget the precise context, but the idea that we can prevent death doesn't really stack up. At some level, we're all ultimately going to die.
Yeah.
And our deaths are in some ways a scandalous open secret. We are so utterly contingent, so dependent on a beating muscle that could stop beating at almost any time. So what the virus does is, again, heightens that experience. Suddenly it's like, hang on, I didn't think my life was a question mark. But the virus says it might be. It's a kind of scandal, also a moment of reckoning. And one of the reasons your life is at risk is that the global system is so thoroughly interdependent and fragile, really fragile, such that even if you can show data showing enormous progress on literacy and medical and scientific advances and even prosperity and people coming out of poverty and young kids learning to read and African nations getting better, you can tell an optimistic story of civilization. But that data will often obscure the underlying fragility of the system,
right?
Which is about a function of interdependence and a function of complex systems only requiring minor changes to create macro major effects.
Right. And this makes me think of our critique of liberalism, which tries to hide death at any cost, right?
Yeah.
And I guess if your wife is Indian, people who live in India, they burn the corpse in the open, so that it's a meditation on death. It seems like this virus, I was thinking, is forcing us into a meditation on death.
If you're feeling that way, you might like this. So when I did the Spirituality Project, death was one of the themes. And the piece of research that I was most taken by was related to a phenomenon known as post-traumatic growth. Yeah. You may have heard of post-traumatic stress, right? Post-traumatic stress, everyone knows about it. It's what military people come back with and we have after trauma and stuff. But post-traumatic growth is a very different phenomenon. It's often people who are close to death, who may have had cancer or may have had an accident. They survive it, and then they're like, okay, what was I doing all that time? Given that I now know my life is so fragile, I think I'll live a bit differently. What the research shows is those who have near-death experiences, not so much in this spiritual, I was looking at my body from above way, but more the kind of, I almost died, and I'm not sure I lived the life I wanted to live way.
Yeah.
If you have that experience, what the research shows is people invariably turn towards a life of more intrinsic value, closer connection to nature and loved ones, their own crafts and pursuits, much less concern for status, much less concern for achievement. But here's the killer. Here's the thing that I find very curious about that. It comes about because people realized they almost died and that they were going to die.
Yeah.
But they knew that already, right?
Yeah.
This is the thing that's very bizarre. It's as if the human being...
Well, we know it intellectually, but we don't have a direct encounter with it, or are able. We're not able to digest it or feel it in a full-on way. And once we do, wow, we wake up.
Right. So I guess what I'm saying is one way of seeing the virus is it's a species-wide encounter with our individual and shared mortality. And that could be ultimately a positive thing, although there will be a lot of tragedy and a lot of heartache and pain and literal asphyxiation along the way. It's dark and it's a moment of reckoning. It's also something that may pass and be forgotten within 6 months.
Yeah.
But I don't sense that at the moment, but it's possible. Part of the sense-making, part of the intelligibility aspect I mentioned earlier is we don't know how long this is going to last. And that's an unusual situation. We have this feeling that there is a normal reality we have to get back to. But I think what this shows is that normal reality was a kind of fiction.
Yeah, the normal reality is a fiction, and everything's going to change on some level, even if everything appears to be somewhat the same. It seems like there has to be some kind of wide systematic change after this. There's just no question about that.
Well,
hold on a minute. I'm being too optimistic.
Well,
we could go back to being the same idiots that we were, always. But
we have a lot of immunity to change. Robert Keegan speaks a lot about this, and I wouldn't be surprised how quickly we can hide this under the carpet, as it were, and get about our business. But one way of seeing this, to bring it back to a more religious sensibility, is this is a moment of profound disequilibrium.
Yeah.
If our habit energy and our main patterns at a societal level are about going through the motions, this is a moment where we're not allowed to go through the motions. We have to change how we live and think and act and reflect. And what that reminds me of is why Jesus used parables. And it seems like a different world, but actually there's a connection. So the connection with Jesus using parables, I'd say, is this. Going into the historical context he was in, there are some people who believe that it's not that Jesus studied Piaget as such, but that he sort of recognized that there was something. I say recognize. If this is God, then this language is a bit absurd, but there was something about the person as teacher, as spiritual teacher, that he realized that in this heavily historically religiously loaded time, where you have the Romans and you have the Pharisees and you have the practices and the ritual purity and who's meant to be a Messiah and who's meant to be a rabbi, and comes into all of that context. And he doesn't say, I am this and this is how things are. He tells lots and lots of stories.
Yeah.
And why would he do that, right? And the claim is, at least in some of the research,
like in Zen, they do the same thing.
Right. It's a little bit like the koans, right?
Yeah.
So he's deliberately creating disequilibrium, because only in that space of disequilibrium can some new understanding emerge, some new self emerge, some new society emerge.
Right.
So you could see the virus as a kind of opening up of that the disequilibrium, allowing us the time to reflect and withdraw and hopefully transform in some way.
Yeah, I imagine it'll be both. I mean, for some people, we'll go just nuts, and then other people will go. It's a chance to actually go on retreat. Like, seems to me like as a practicing Buddhist for 20 years, going on retreat is something where you actually go deeper into life. It's not an escape from life. It's actually you go deeper into life, and it's a chance to do that.
Yeah, I hope so. I mean, I fear we might be relatively lucky in this regard. I think for others, you've got cramped living quarters.
Exactly.
You have domestic violence. You have, there are other ways of telling the story.
Oh, God.
But I mean, certainly in principle, it affords that opportunity, amongst other things.
Yeah, I mean, you're right to mention that. It could just, people could retreat into their hell, right? Whereas they might have had a way out before. So it's both things.